The wagon's wheels creaked like tired bones, as Clara Hartwell urged the mule through the last stretch of road. Dust rose with each turn, though the air carried the smell of rain, heavy and metallic, waiting to break. Her hands ached from the reins, raw from weeks of travel. In the back of the wagon lay what little remained of her life: a cedar chest with brass hinges tarnished by time, a folded wedding dress pressed flat by grief, and a Bible that still carried her husband's name in faded ink. That was on O'Kin to speak of, no child's laughter to lighten the hours. The town appeared suddenly, crouched against the horizon, more shadows than substance in the dimming light. Lanterns glimmered in a few windows, weak against the storm rolling down from the high ridges. Clara felt the prickle of eyes upon her as she passed the saloon and the general store. Men leaned against posts, their hats tilted low, their whispers sharp. Women drew their children close, as though sorrow might be a contagion carried in her skirts. No hand lifted in welcome. No door opened. She pressed on. Each creak of the wagon seemed to echo her own emptiness. By the time the mule stumbled to a stop at the edge of town, the first drops of rain struck the dust, making dark, spreading spots that smelled of earth and thunder. Ahead, across a long stretch of pale grass, she saw the outline of a ranch house against the rising storm. Jonas Hale's name had been spoken to her in town, though not kindly. A man alone, scarred by war, whose land brushed too close to the hunting paths of the tribes. He was described as hard, silent, a figure who belonged more to stone than to flesh. Still, a roof was a roof, and Clara had nowhere else to go. The ride to his ranch was a slow, jolting crawl, the wheels threatening to break with each rut. When at last she pulled into the yard, the rain had thickened, hissing against the boards of the barn. Jonas appeared at the doorway, lantern in hand, his frame tall, shoulders squared with the habit of solitude. The light caught his face, scars like pale seams stitched across weather-brown skin. His eyes, though steady, carried the kind of weariness a man cannot scrub away. "What do you want?" His voice was low, rough, a sound shaped by disuse. Clara tightened her shawl against her shoulders, rain dripping from the edge of her bonnet. "Only a roof for the night. I'll not trouble you beyond that." His gaze flicked to the wagon, to the cedar chest, to the mule too thin for the work asked of it. Silence stretched, broken only by the patter of rain. She thought he might send her back into the storm, and for a moment, her throat tightened with the shame of begging. But Jonas's eyes lingered on her face a beat longer than necessity required, as though he recognized a hollowness that matched his own. He stepped aside at last. "You'll find a corner by the fire. Don't expect more." The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, the walls bare but clean. A rocking chair stood near the hearth, its seat worn smooth by long, solitary evenings. Clara set her chest down in the corner, the wood damp from rain, and lowered herself onto a stool by the fire. Her hands trembled as she held them out to the flames. Feeling warmth seep into her bones, Jonas moved about the room in silence, unbuckling his gun belt, setting it against the wall. His presence filled the cabin the way a storm filled the sky, solid, unavoidable. Yet he asked her no questions, offered no words of comfort. Still, he had not turned her away, and that was mercy enough. Outside, the rain thickened into a steady roar, drumming on the roof. Inside, two strangers shared the hush of firelight, their shadows cast together upon the walls. Neither spoke of what had been lost, nor of what might lie ahead. But in the quiet, Clara felt something stirring. Echo of loneliness answered, though faintly, by another soul's silence. She folded her shawl tighter, bowed her head, and whispered a prayer no one heard. Jonas sat in the rocker, his gaze fixed on the fire, his face unreadable. The storm raged beyond the walls, but within the cabin there settled a strange, fragile truce to lives, abandoned in different ways, now bound by the small act of not sending each other back into the dark. The days stretched out long and quiet, each one carrying the same dry wind through the cracks in the walls. Clara rose early to sweep the hearth, to shake out the blankets, to make herself useful in a house that felt less like a home and more like a watchtower. Jonas never asked her to do any of it, but the silence between them pressed so hard she feared it might crush her if she did not fill it with the small rustle of work. She mended shirts where the seams had split from years of wear, her needle pricking cloth by the firelight. She straightened the rocker near the window, rubbing a cloth across the curve of its arms, imagining the weight of evenings Jonas must have spent in it, staring into nothing. Sometimes she hummed a hymn her mother once sang when she was a child, her voice low, half apologetic, as though even sound required permission here. The quiet was not cruel, only unyielding. Every movement reminded Clara of what she had lost, how she once sewed dresses no child would wear, how she once sang lullabies to silence. Each scar on Jonas's face seemed to echo her emptiness, though he never spoke of the battles that carved them. They lived like ghosts, circling the same fire, aware of each other, but afraid of stirring the ashes. It was while sweeping that she found it. The broom handle knocked against the leg of Jonas's bed, and she saw the edge of a box hidden in the shadows beneath. Cedar, like her own chest, though smaller, with a brass clasp. She would not have touched it, save for the impulse of knowing something lay beneath the quiet that ruled this house. When she opened it, her breath caught. A braid of hair, pale brown, tied with a faded ribbon, lay coiled inside. It was not cut roughly, but with care, as though kept as a remembrance. She closed the lid gently and slid the box back where it had been, her heart heavy with the knowledge that Jonas, too, kept ghosts near at hand. Whatever woman the braid had belonged to, wife, sister, lover, she was still present in this house. The way Clara's dead remained with her in the wedding dress folded at the bottom of her chest. Neither had spoken of their grief, yet it was there, in every quiet space, pressing against the walls like an unseen wind. In town, whispers grew louder. Clara had been seen arriving with nothing but a mule and a chest. Some pitied her, shaking their heads at the tragedy that had left her childless and alone. Others distrusted her, a stranger come without kin, a woman living under a man's roof without the sanction of church vows. Words reached her ears when she went for flour or thread, carried and lowered voices not meant for her but never truly hidden. To be a widow was burden enough, but to be new among them, without children to soften her presence, was to stand always at the edge. She caught looks, too, in the saloon windows, in the mercantile aisles, half curiosity, half suspicion. Once, a woman muttered that sorrow clung like smoke, and Clara felt the shame of it, though she had not asked for the sorrow she carried. Rumors thickened like the clouds that hung over the mountains. Talk of raids, of stolen cattle, of blood spilled on both sides between settlers and the neighboring tribe. Fear has a way of sharpening distrust, and Clara, already adrift, felt the weight of being marked an outsider twice over. She belonged neither to the town nor to Jonas's house. She was suspended in some middle place where her past was too heavy to carry, and her future too faint to imagine. Even so, the nights in the cabin grew different, almost imperceptibly. Jonas would sit by the fire after supper, hands clasped, his eyes set on the flames. Clara mended in silence beside him, the crackle of the logs the only sound between them. Once, when her needle slipped and pricked her finger, Jonas looked up, his gaze lingering, as though he might speak. He did not, but the weight of his glance was different than before. Less guarded, less distant, as if he had begun to see not merely a burden in his house, but someone carrying a grief parallel to his own. She lay awake some nights, staring at the rafters, thinking of the braid hidden beneath his bed and the dress folded in her chest. Both tokens of lives gone, both reminders of how the past refused to loosen its grip. Yet there was a strange comfort in knowing she was not alone in such keeping. His silence no longer felt like rejection, but recognition. The cabin walls creaked in the wind. Dishes clattered softly as she set them to dry. The rocker whispered against the floorboards. All of it became a language between them, a way of speaking without words. In the quiet, Clara began to understand that Jonas was less the stone figure the town described, and more a man bracing against his own storms. And in that understanding, faint as the first light before dawn, the seed of companionship took root, not spoken, not yet trusted, but present. Two mourners beneath one roof, no longer entirely alone. The storm announced itself first in the air. By mid-afternoon, the sky had turned a strange green-gray, heavy with a silence that made the cattle restless and the mule paw at the ground. Clara stood at the window, shawl gathered tight about her shoulders, watching the horizon. The ridges were already swallowed by rolling clouds, dark as iron, streaked with veins of white fire. She thought of how storms could cleanse, or destroy, or both at once. By the time the first clap of thunder shook the valley, Jonas had already pulled tools and feed into the barn. The wind carried dust and grit in wild eddies across the yard, lashing her skirts as she hurried to carry what she could indoors. Rain fell sudden and hard, hammering the roof like stones, slipping down the boards in narrow rivulets. It was then she saw him, a boy darting across the yard, hair plastered to his brow, feet bare and cut from the gravel. He disappeared into the barn, vanishing like a shadow swallowed by the storm. Clara gasped, her hand rising to her mouth, but Jonas caught the movement, his eyes narrowing. He pulled his rifle from the wall, though he did not lift it. When they entered the barn, the lantern light found him huddled near the hay, no more than 12 years of age, an Apache child with eyes dark and wide, shoulders drawn in as though braced for a blow. Rain dripped from his thin shirt, pooling beneath him. Jonas's jaw tightened. The lines of his face deepened, torn between the law of settlers and the tug of something older than lawmercy. "He can't stay," Jonas muttered, though his voice lacked force. "Bringing him in will bring trouble." Clara looked at the boy, shivering, silent, his hands curled against his knees. Without speaking, she set down the lantern and fetched a piece of bread from the kitchen. She knelt, offering it as one would to a bird in winter. Careful, unhurried, the boy's eyes flicked to hers, suspicious, then hungry, then softening. He took it at last, and with the other hand she laid her shawl over his shoulders. Jonas stood in silence, watching, the storm raging at his back. For a long time, nothing passed between them but the hiss of rain and the distant rumble of thunder. Later, when the wind drove water through the seams of the roof, Jonas built a fire in the hearth. Clara guided the boy into the cabin, seating him near the flames. the shawl now dark, with damp but warm against him. He ate quietly, never lifting his eyes long, though once she thought she saw gratitude flicker like the lightning that split the sky outside. The storm grew wild, shaking the shutters, rattling the tin buckets set beneath the leak, near the door. Shadows leaped on the walls. 3 figures now, where before there had been only 2. Clara hummed under her breath as she fetched another blanket, her voice carrying a note of gentleness she had not heard in herself for years. Jonas said little. He sat in the rocker, his rifle leaning against the wall, his eyes not on the boy but on Clara. There was something unsettling in how naturally she moved toward the child, as if mothering were a muscle memory not even grief could kill. The sight stirred something in him he would not name. When at last the boy slept, curled on the rug before the fire, Clara lingered at his side, smoothing the shawl, brushing damp hair from his forehead. She felt her chest ached not with sorrow alone, but with the memory of how it felt to care for someone without calculation or fear. It frightened her, yet it steadied her, too. That night, when she lay down in her corner, sleep brought her a dream. Children's laughter filled the cabin, bright and tumbling, so real she reached out her hand to catch it, but she awoke to the steady drip of water in the bucket, the smell of wet earth heavy in the air. The dream broke like glass, and she wept quietly into her hands. The sound nearly lost in the storm. Jonas stirred in the other room. He heard her, though he did not rise. His eyes stayed open long after, fixed on the rafters, listening to her muffled sobs, the boy's even breathing, and the thunder rolling away into the dark. He said nothing, but in the silence that followed, something shifted in him like dry ground, drinking the first drops of rain. The storm passed, but its echo lingered in the house. The boy remained, rising early with Clara to gather wood, fetching water from the creek with careful steps, his silence steady as a shadow. He spoke little, though sometimes he would glance toward the horizon with an expression that held both longing and fear. Jonas never asked his name, and the boy never offered it. Yet he stayed, and the days fell into a rhythm, uneasy but not without a fragile thread of peace. That thread soon frayed. Riders came by the ranch, faces set hard beneath the brims of their hats, voices sharpened by suspicion. They leaned from their saddles, calling out to Jonas in tones that left no room for kindness. "Word is you've taken in one of them," a man spat, hand never straying far from the rifle at his thigh. "Ain't wise to shelter the enemy. Best send him back to where he belongs." Jonas stood with his arms crossed, jaw clenched, his eyes unreadable. He gave no answer, and his silence only deepened their distrust. Clara, heart hammering, stepped forward before she could think better of it. Her voice wavered, yet she forced the words out. "He's only a child. There's no threat in him." The men turned their gaze on her, their scorn sharp as a whip. She faltered beneath it, but did not withdraw. Jonas said nothing, though when the riders left, dust rising in their wake, Clara saw how his hand lingered near the butt of his rifle. His silence had spoken for them. Both he would not turn the boy out. Inside the cabin, the air grew heavy, charged with tension neither storm nor fire could dispel. Jonas moved through the rooms with the measured pace of a man, bracing himself against a world that might come breaking through his door at any moment. Clara felt the weight of her own inadequacy, pressed down harder. She could not give him children, not fill the silence of his house with laughter that was his by blood. Yet here she was, cradling a life not her own, setting food before the boy, brushing mud from his feet, tucking the shawl closer about his shoulders. Each act both comforted and condemned her, reminding her of what she could never bear, yet what she still might give. Jonas, for his part, found himself split in two. Part of him longed for the quiet that had once been his companion, the simple rhythm of land and cattle, unbroken by voices or fragile bonds. The other part, though, could not ignore the way Clara's presence softened the cabin's edges, or the way the boy's steady breathing filled the night with something that felt almost like belonging. That hope cut deep, raw as an old scar reopened. The days drew longer, and whispers in town grew louder. Clara could feel it each time she rode in for flour, or nails the glance over a shoulder, the way voices hushed when she stepped into a store. She carried it back with her, like grit in her shawl. The boy noticed too, though he said nothing. His silence carried a wisdom older than his years. Then, one evening, the riders returned. This time, their leader dismounted, rifle in hand, the butt sunk deep in the mud as though planted there like a stake. His eyes burned with a kind of righteousness that left no room for mercy. "Keep your house clean, Hale," he said. "We won't warn you again." The words hung in the dusk like smoke. Clara's stomach knotted, and she clutched the edge of her shawl until her knuckles ached. Jonas did not flinch, did not reach for his weapon. He only stood, shoulders squared, eyes steady. His silence was a wall, impenetrable, a vow unspoken. When the men rode off, Clara turned to him, searching his face. For the first time, she saw not just the scars of battles fought long ago, but the shape of a promise. He would not yield her, nor the boy, to the cruelty of fear. He would stand, even if it meant standing alone. That night, the cabin felt changed. The fire burned low, the boy slept near the hearth, and Jonas sat in his rocker, the weight of his decision pressing heavy on him. Clara sat nearby, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered. She understood then that healing did not always come in the return of what had been stolen, but in the shelter one offered to what arrived unexpectedly. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was a shield, drawn tight around three souls who, for reasons they could not yet name, had chosen to remain under the same roof. The storm that birthed the lightning came and went with little rain, leaving behind a sky that flickered with strange light. At first, Jonas thought nothing of it. The prairie often held its tempests like secrets, loosing them in sudden violence, then retreating into silence. But when the smell of smoke reached the porch, sharp and bitter on the night air, he knew the land itself had caught fire. He was running before Clara called his name. Out in the pasture, flames leaped like wild creatures, driven by the wind. The dry grass caught fast, sending a wall of orange racing toward the barn. The cattle bawled in terror, their shapes black against the inferno. Jonas seized a shovel, slamming earth against the fire line, each strike furious, futile. Clara stumbled after him with a pail of water, the boy behind her carrying another. They threw what they could, the steam hissing uselessly against the blaze. Jonas barked for them to keep low, but the wind shifted and smoke rolled over them, choking, blinding. Still, they fought. 3 against a monster that did not tire. Clara's shawl slipped from her shoulders as she hauled water again and again, her breath ragged. Her hands blistered against the bucket's iron handle, but she would not stop. Jonas saw her stagger, saw the boy clutch her arm, urging her back, yet she pressed forward with stubborn fire in her eyes. For the first time since he'd known her, she burned with something greater than fierce, unyielding defiance. But her body betrayed her. Mid-stride, she crumpled, the bucket falling, water spilling useless into the dirt. Jonas's heart lurched. He was at her side in a breath, scooping her up, her weight light in his arms. Smoke curled around them, thick as night. His voice tore loose then, not measured, not the silence he had carried for years, but raw, ragged with fear. Don't leave me. Clara, stay with me. His words cracked, desperate, more plea than command. He carried her through the smoke, his eyes stinging, lungs burning. The boy followed close, half lost in the haze, clutching Jonas's coat as though it tethered him to life. They reached the cabin, and Jonas laid her on the bed, her face pale, lips parted in shallow breaths. He fumbled with a cup of water, pressing it to her lips, his hands shaking. The boy hovered near, his small fingers gripping the quilt, wide eyes reflecting both firelight and fear. Outside, the blaze consumed half the pasture before the wind died and the night grew heavy with ash. Jonas fought it back alone, shoulders straining, until the barn was saved and only blackened earth remained. He returned at dawn Suit Street, his shirt torn, his breath harsh as a man who had wrestled the devil and barely stood. Inside, the room glowed dim with the first gray light of morning. Clara stirred, opening her eyes. She found herself not on the hearthrug where she had collapsed, but in Jonas's own bed, his shadow beside her. His hand lay open on the quilt, close enough to touch. She turned her head, weak, and saw his face creased with exhaustion, eyes red not only from smoke. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, softly, almost as though ashamed to speak, the words broke free. "Mother," he began, his voice rough, "your legs are shattered, and you have no children. From this moment on, I will be your father." The words might have cut, but there was no cruelty in them. They fell, instead, like a vow, spoken in the quiet aftermath of ruin. He was not mocking her barrenness, nor her grief. He was naming the bond that had begun to form, one not born of blood, but of fire, and the choice to remain. He would carry what she could not, as she had begun to carry him in ways unseen. Clara's eyes filled, though she could not speak. She understood then what the fire had burned away, not only the pasture, but the silence that had stood like a wall between them. What remained was something stripped bare, fragile but unbreakable. The boy slept on a blanket near the hearth, his small body curled, save for the first time in many nights. Clara watched the rise and fall of his breathing, then turned her gaze back to Jonas. He had closed his eyes, leaning back in the chair, as if the weight of his words had left him more weary than the night's battle. She did not move her hand fully to his, but she let her fingers rest near his own, the distance small enough that the warmth could travel across it. She understood now that love could be chosen, shaped not by womb or bloodline, but by fire and the vow of endurance. Outside, the fields lay scorched, blackened scars, against the horizon. But in the cabin, something new had survived the blaze, something that felt like the first tender shoot breaking through the ash. The word came before the dust of their boots. Jonas saw the soldiers crest the ridge at midday, their blue coats stark against the horizon. Clara stood at the window, hands pressed to the sill, her breath shallow. The boy froze where he sat, whittling quietly, the small knife stilling in his hand. The silence inside the cabin grew taut, the kind that hums before thunder. Jonas rose without a word, taking his rifle from its place by the door. His jaw was set, his shoulders squared. Though Clara saw the shadow in his eyes, the knowledge that defiance came with a price. She stepped to his side anyway, though her knees shook and her palms dampened against her skirt. The boy moved toward the barn, but Jonas raised a hand to stop him. "Stay," he said softly. The soldiers rode close, dust swirling around their horses' hooves. The man at their head dismounted first, boots striking the earth with authority. His voice carried, clipped, and cold. "We've been told you harbor an Apache child. You'll hand him over." Jonas said nothing at first. His silence was heavy, more cutting than words. When he did speak, his voice was low, steady, but unyielding. "He stays." The officer's gaze narrowed. "You put yourself against the law, against the safety of your neighbors." He gestured, and two soldiers shifted, rifles glinting in the sun. Clara's breath caught, but she did not move from Jonas's side. The standoff hung sharp in the air. Each heartbeat its own drum. Jonas raised his rifle slightly, not aiming, but making his meaning clear. The boy stood now in the doorway, his small body framed against the shadows of the cabin. He looked between them all, then stepped forward, his voice thin but brave. "No war," he said, the English halting, each word hard-won. "No fight, I want peace." His dark eyes lifted, meeting the officer's with a steadiness beyond his years. The soldiers shifted uneasily. The officer hesitated, his jaw tightening, his eyes darting from Jonas to Clara, then to the boy. For a long moment, the prairie itself seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned away. "Mount up," he ordered curtly. "This isn't worth blood." Boots scraped, reins snapped, and the soldiers wheeled their horses. Within moments, the ridge swallowed them, leaving only the churned dust of their passing. The silence after was deafening. Clara's knees nearly gave, but Jonas steadied her with a hand at her arm. The boy stood still, the knife he had carried now clutched like a talisman. He did not cry, though his lips trembled. That night, he came to Clara with something small in his palm. A carving, rough but careful. A man and woman, side by side, their figures simple, yet bound together. He pressed it into her hand, his gaze dropping as though ashamed of its simplicity. Clara felt her throat tighten. She held it like one might hold a relic, her fingers tracing the lines again and again. By morning, the boy was gone. No sound of footsteps, no call of farewell, only the absence that echoed in the cabin's corners. On the table where he had eaten, a folded scrap of cloth lay neatly. Clara lifted it, pressing it to her chest. The cedar scent of smoke and wood lingering faintly. Jonas saddled the horses at dawn. The land lay scarred from fire, yet washed clean by night air. Clara stepped onto the porch, the figurine still in her hand, its wood warmed by her touch. Jonas looked at her, then not as burden, not as guest, but as something forged beside him through storm and fire. When he lifted her onto the horse. It was not an act of pity but of recognition, as though in that gesture he was binding them together before the eyes of the land itself. She met his gaze, and for the first time since her long road of loss began, she did not feel abandoned. They rode into town side by side. Dust curling around the hooves, the horizon stretching wide and endless. To those who saw them pass, they were not the fragments of grief they once had been, but a pair tempered by trial, carrying with them the faint promise of a different kind of kinship. Clara held the figurine close, and in the rhythm of the horse beneath her, she felt something steady like the pulse of a life not lost, but remade. Jonas rode with his scars, with his silence, but no longer as a man bound by loneliness. He rode as a protector, not because the world demanded it of him, but because his heart had chosen it. The prairie wind swept around them, carrying with it the scent of ash and grass, and Clara knew, as the town drew near, that she was no longer a woman, adrift. She was written into a new story, one carved not by fate, but by the hands of those who had chosen to remain.